Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The large courtroom of the New Haven courthouse was silent, almost stifling. The high ceilings, adorned with antique moldings, seemed to absorb every whisper, every breath. Rows of polished wooden benches held families, reporters, and a few curious onlookers, all there to witness a trial that had already made headlines. At the center, behind her judge's desk, stood Clarissa Bennett, a 45-year-old black woman known for her rigor, impartiality, and unwavering reputation in the judicial system. Her deep brown eyes surveyed the room with a calm but commanding intensity. Her hands, placed on the desk, were slightly clenched. She knew that every decision she made today would be scrutinized, commented on, criticized. In the audience, one young man stood out for his visible agitation. Malik Johnson, 19, dressed in a black hoodie and jeans, clenched his fists during each of the prosecutor's and defense's remarks. His brother had been killed in a controversial courtroom incident, and Malik had grown up with a bitter feeling that the system wasn't designed to protect his loved ones. Today, he wasn't just there to observe the trial, he was there to confront justice itself. The murmur of the spectators faded as the clerk announced the start of the hearing. Judge Bennett, in her impeccable black gown, raised her hand and declared in a clear, calm voice, "We will begin this hearing. May truth and justice guide our proceedings." But in Malik's mind, no words, no proceedings could temper the anger and pain that had accumulated over the years. He already knew that this trial would be a confrontation far greater than any law could contain. And in a remote corner of the room, cameras and reporters busied themselves, capturing every movement, every expression, every emotion. No one suspected that in a few moments, a scream would ring out and shatter the heavy silence in the courtroom, a scream that would change everything. The courtroom seemed even more stifling now that the trial had begun. Clarissa Bennett's every breath was measured, every movement calculated. She scanned her notes, examined the evidence, and questioned the witnesses with surgical precision. Her gaze, always piercing, let nothing slip. Malik Johnson, sitting in the back row, watched every movement intently. He clenched his fists, gently slapped his thighs, unable to remain still. The judge's imposed silence wasn't enough to calm his anger. For him, Clarissa's every word wasn't neutral, she represented a system that had destroyed his family. The prosecutor, Richard Hayes, a man in his 50s in an impeccable suit, stepped forward to question the first witness. His voice echoed through the room. "Can you describe what you saw that evening?" The witness, a nervous young woman, timidly recounted the events. Malik listened, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw the faces of the victims, he heard their screams in his memories, and he felt the weight of an accumulated injustice. Beside him, a few spectators murmured among themselves, whispering about Malik's attitude. Some found him insolent, others perceived the pain shining through his eyes. He didn't hear them. All he saw was the judge. She stood there, motionless, firm, looking at the witness without any apparent emotion. Then, a detail caught his attention, the way Clarissa annotated her notes, almost mechanically, without a word of comfort for the family present in the room. For Malik, this gesture symbolized the indifference of a cold and distant system. His heart pounded, his mind churned. And at that precise moment, he knew he could no longer contain his anger. He didn't just want to shout his displeasure, he wanted the whole room to understand how he felt. What he was about to say would be irreversible. Malik stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on Clarissa. The silence in the room became almost palpable. All eyes turned toward him. In a breath that trembled with emotion, he said without hesitation, "You are a murderer." Shock rippled through the room. The murmurs died down. The jury, the lawyers, the reporters, and even the frozen witness, no one dared speak. Judge Bennett, however, remained motionless, her face impassive. But a flicker of astonishment flashed in her eyes, she had never faced such an accusation in a courtroom. The trial had just turned upside down. The anger of a young man had just shattered the solemnity of justice, and no one was ready to see what was to come. Malik's shout echoed through the courtroom again, leaving behind a heavy, almost unreal silence. The usual murmurs, the creaking of benches, and the rustling of papers had died away. Everyone stared at Malik, frozen, unable to react immediately. Judge Clarissa Bennett sat upright, her hands resting on the desk. Her face remained impassive, but her mind raced. Never in her long career had she heard a young man accuse her like this, out loud, in a courtroom. It wasn't just an insult, it was an act of defiance, a cry of pain, an outburst of perceived injustice. Around them, the jury seemed torn between shock and disbelief. Some looked down, unsure where to look. Others exchanged worried glances, whispering questions no one dared to utter aloud. Prosecutor Richard Hayes frowned, visibly taken aback. "Mr. Johnson," he tried to say firmly, but the usual tone of authority didn't work. Malik, still standing, was breathing heavily, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I will not remain silent." Malik shouted, his voice trembling but full of determination, "My family has suffered because of this system, and you represent this system." The room hung on his every word. The audience, some shocked, others touched by his sincerity, held their breath. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every emotion, every micro-expression. For Clarissa, this moment was both a challenge and a revelation. She knew she had to maintain order and dignity at court, but she also understood that Malik's anger was not gratuitous. She took a deep breath, rising slowly to speak, her voice firm but calm. "Mr. Johnson, I understand your anger and pain. But the law does not bend to emotion. It demands fairness and proof. You will have your chance to express yourself within the appropriate legal framework." Malik shook his head, refusing to sit down. His youth and emotion were stronger than the gravity of the courtroom. The prosecutor tried again to seat him, but Clarissa raised her hand, stopping any intervention. "Let him speak. Let's hear what he has to say." These words surprised everyone. Even the defense attorneys exchanged incredulous glances. Clarissa Bennett had just displayed unusual calm and openness, recognizing that sometimes, justice must also listen to a young man's broken heart. And in that heavy silence, Malik felt for the first time that his voice, his cry, had weight. It was no longer just an impulsive act, it was the beginning of a confrontation that would shake the courtroom, hearts, and consciences. Malik's scream continued to resonate through the courtroom, an echo no one could ignore. Even after Judge Clarissa Bennett spoke her calm words, the silence hung heavy over everyone present. The tension was palpable, almost tangible, as if the air itself had been frozen by the accusation. The jury, lawyers, witnesses, and reporters stood frozen, their eyes flickering between the judge and Malik. No one had ever witnessed such a direct and personal confrontation in this room. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, aware that the slightest gesture could change the course of the hearing. Malik stood at a loss for what to do. His anger was still there, but now it was mixed with a sense of incomprehension. Why didn't anyone seem to be reacting the way he expected? He wanted justice, recognition, but instead, he felt isolated, alone against a world of black robes and cold stares. Clarissa looked at him for a long time, her eyes piercing but filled with a strange compassion. She wasn't blind to his pain, she knew that this cry came from a broken heart and not from mere provocation. Every word he spoke carried the weight of years of injustice, absence, and family wounds. "I'm listening, Malik," she said finally, her voice soft but firm, breaking through the silence like a ray of light. Malik blinked in surprise. No one had ever listened to him like this, especially not in a place where he felt judged and powerless. His shoulders, tense from the start, relaxed slightly. He felt that his anger hadn't been ignored, that his cry finally had some impact. In the rows, a few spectators exchanged worried but admiring glances. The judge's quiet strength had transformed a moment of confrontation into one of possible understanding. Even the normally inflexible and domineering prosecutor Richard Hayes sensed a slight hesitation in her posture. Malik took a deep breath. For the first time in years, he felt his voice could reach someone. His words were no longer just a howl of pain, they were the beginning of a dialogue, fragile but real, with the authority figure he had once perceived as a symbol of injustice. And as the room remained silent, the world seemed suspended, as if everyone was waiting to see how this improbable confrontation would evolve. The heavy silence in the courtroom finally broke, but not in the way anyone expected. Whispers drifted through the ranks like a light wind, hesitant but persistent. Some spectators seemed shocked, others intrigued, and a few smiled curiously. Everyone was trying to understand what had just happened. Prosecutor Richard Hayes stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Johnson, please sit down immediately," he ordered, his voice sharp and authoritative. But Malik didn't move. He kept his gaze fixed on Judge Clarissa Bennett, trying to read a human reaction in her eyes, an emotion that would justify his own anger. "Let him talk," the judge suddenly interrupted, her voice firm and sharp as a blade. The prosecutor froze. The lawyers and the jury exchanged incredulous glances. No one would have thought that a judge would invite an accuser to speak like this, right in the middle of the courtroom. Malik felt a shiver run down his spine. This simple word, this unexpected gesture, gave him a little courage, a little strength. His trembling voice continued, but this time with more clarity. "You have to understand, you don't know what it's like to lose someone because of this system. My brother, he's dead, and no one was punished." The murmur in the room grew louder. Some spectators looked away, embarrassed by the emotional charge of his words, while others listened attentively, fascinated by Malik's audacity and sincerity. Clarissa stood there, outwardly impassive, but inside, she felt a pang of pain. She knew that every word Malik spoke reflected a mixture of truth and biased perception. This young man had been broken by life, and his anger wasn't directed at her personally, but at everything she stood for, the justice system, the law, authority. A witness, visibly moved, discreetly wiped away a tear. The courtroom was no longer just a place of trial, it had become a theater of human emotion, where every heart beat in time with the prosecution. And amidst this palpable tension, Malik felt a strange mix of fear and liberation. He had just challenged authority, but for the first time, he felt as if someone was truly listening to him. Judge Bennett, with her calm and quiet strength, had just transformed an explosive confrontation into a fragile but possible dialogue. In that suspended moment, everyone understood that the trial would never be the same again. This young man had shaken the courtroom to its foundations, and no one was yet ready to measure the shockwave that would follow. As the courtroom held its breath, Malik felt the weight of all those years of pain crash down on him. He took a deep breath and this time spoke in a firmer, but still shaky, voice. "You must know why I'm screaming. You must understand why I called you a murderer." The murmurs immediately stopped. Even District Attorney Richard Hayes, the lawyers, and the jury were listening intently, captivated in spite of themselves. Malik stood, his gaze fixed on Judge Clarissa Bennett, and began to tell his family's story. "My brother, Jamal, was 20 years old. He was a student, a dreamer, full of life. But one night, he was wrongly accused of a crime he hadn't committed. A mistake by the police, a mistake by the system. And before anyone could help him, he was gone." Tears welled up in his eyes, but he didn't look away. Every word echoed through the room like pain and anger. He recounted the long nights spent fighting to prove his brother's innocence, the letters he ignored, the calls he didn't answer. "You wear the garb of justice, Madam Judge. But that garb cannot erase the pain we have suffered. You represent the system that failed to protect my brother. And that is why I call you a murderer." For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to pause. Even the journalists, armed with their cameras, lowered their eyes, touched by the young man's sincerity. It wasn't a provocation. It wasn't a gratuitous insult. It was a cry from the heart, a call for recognition of pain and injustice. Clarissa Bennett stood behind her desk and remained silent. Her eyes softened slightly. She understood now that this accusation was not directed at her personally, but at a system she served. She knew that every decision she made could seem cruel to those who had lost something irreplaceable. Malik, feeling his words finally resonate, took a deep breath. For the first time in years, he felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. He had dared to speak out, to reveal his pain, to confront justice itself. But he knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom, the spectators, and even the judge had just understood that this case wasn't just about the law, it was about lives, suffering, and often ignored human truths. And in that heavy but meaningful silence, everyone understood that this trial had just changed dimension. Malik's anger was no longer a simple impulsive cry, it was a call for true justice. The silence in the courtroom was almost deafening. Everyone present held their breath, watching Malik Johnson, the young man standing there, trembling but determined, and Judge Clarissa Bennett, motionless behind her desk, her piercing eyes staring intently at the young man. Clarissa took a deep breath. She knew that responding to such an accusation was delicate. If she did so angrily, she risked breaking this fragile dialogue. If she remained silent for too long, the room might interpret her inaction as indifference. Finally, his voice, firm but filled with calm, rose. "Mr. Johnson, I'm listening to you. I'm listening because what you feel is real, and because the pain you carry deserves to be heard." Malik blinked in surprise. He had never heard a recognized authority acknowledge his suffering with such sincerity. The weight of his years of anger seemed to be lifting, if only a little. "I am not your enemy," continued Clarissa, "and I would never want to be a source of your pain. But I am bound by the law, and the law requires that I be fair to all, even when it seems cruel to some." Malik felt his heart clench. He understood part of what Clarissa meant, but the rage and pain pent up inside him were still too strong. "So why are so many people losing their loved ones to this system?" he asked, his voice shaky but clear. Clarissa slowly approached the desk, her hands resting gently on the polished wood. "Because the system is human, Malik. And humans make mistakes. My role, our role, is to limit those mistakes as much as possible, to protect those who can be protected, and to correct those that occur. What you feel, this anger, is legitimate. But the path to transforming this pain into justice does not involve hasty accusations. It involves understanding, action, and commitment." Malik felt a mixture of respect and frustration. He wanted to believe her words, but his scars ran deep. Yet something was changing inside him. Judge Bennett, with her calm and dignity, had just shown that justice could be both strict and humane, rigid yet compassionate. For the first time in years, Malik felt he could be heard. His words had found a listening ear. And in that suspended moment, he understood that this confrontation was not a battle between them, but the beginning of a difficult and necessary dialogue, a dialogue that might one day change his perception of justice. Hours after the incident in the courtroom, videos and testimonies were already circulating on social media and in local media. Malik Johnson's shout, accusing Judge Clarissa Bennett of being a murderer, was filmed and shared by several spectators present. The video quickly went viral. Comments poured in from all sides. Some condemned Malik's behavior as disrespectful and impulsive. Others, however, sympathized with his pain and applauded his courage in publicly expressing the injustice he had suffered. National television networks picked up the story. Reporters debated the role of youth in the justice system, the legitimacy of direct accusations, and how anger could be expressed without violating the law. The New Haven courtroom had become a symbol of a conflict between personal pain and the institution. In the courtroom, Clarissa Bennett followed the events through the media and reports from her assistants. She quickly realized that the situation had gone beyond the trial. She felt responsible not only for justice in this specific case, but also for how the event would be perceived by the public. "It's more than just a trial now," she whispered to her clerk. "This is a moment that could change the way people view justice." Malik, for his part, was at home, observing the reactions online. He felt a mixture of apprehension and pride. For the first time, his voice was being heard far beyond the courtroom walls. Strangers were writing to express their support, share similar experiences, or simply thank the young man for daring to speak out. But the media impact also had its dark side. Malik received hostile messages, some threatening his safety. He realized that his speaking out, while cathartic, had also exposed him to intense and sometimes cruel public judgment. Clarissa, aware of this exposure, decided to contact Malik to inform him that she was not his enemy and that she wished to continue the dialogue begun in the courtroom. She understood that the emotion of the moment should be guided by reason and understanding, not by the impulsiveness of social media. So what began as a cry of pain in a courtroom became a national event. The young man and the judge were now linked by a moment in history, each representing a different perspective on justice, anger, and compassion. The whole world was watching, waiting to see how this confrontation would evolve and what Malik and Clarissa would do with this unique opportunity for dialogue and understanding. A few days after the trial, the New Haven courtroom was quiet. The media frenzy had subsided slightly, but the story of Malik and Judge Clarissa Bennett continued to circulate in newspapers and on social media. Clarissa had asked to meet with the young man privately, hoping to turn their confrontation into a constructive dialogue. They found themselves in a small, discreet office in the courthouse. Malik entered hesitantly, his hands in his pockets, his gaze both defiant and worried. Clarissa, sitting behind her desk, raised her head and waved at him. "Hello, Malik," she said softly, "thank you for agreeing to meet me." Malik nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground. After a moment of silence, he spoke. "I don't know if I can trust you, after what happened." Clarissa smiled slightly, sympathetic but firm. "I understand. What you did in the courtroom was courageous, but it was also dangerous for you. I want you to know that I never meant to harm you personally. I just want to understand your pain." Malik felt some of his anger ease. He began to tell his story in more detail, memories of his brother Jamal, the nights spent trying to prove his innocence, the frustration with a system that seemed deaf to his distress. Each word was heavy with pain, but also with sincerity. Clarissa listened attentively, taking in every detail, sometimes asking a clarifying question, but always with respect and calm. She understood that Malik wasn't trying to attack her personally, but was seeking recognition, a space to express his pain and frustration. "Your anger is legitimate," she said finally, "but you have to learn to channel it so that it becomes a driving force for change, and not a burden that destroys you." Malik looked at her, surprised by her understanding. He had never met an authority figure who could listen without judgment, who could see beyond the anger to the pain. For the first time, he felt he could speak without being interrupted or humiliated. Their conversation lasted several hours. They discussed justice, responsibility, loss, but also hope. Clarissa shared her experience in the justice system, the dilemmas she faced, and the mistakes she had seen and corrected. Malik spoke of his commitment to fighting injustice and his desire to change the system so that others would not suffer as he had. At the end of the meeting, Malik stood up, his gaze clearer and more determined. "Thank you, Madam Judge," he said, his voice calmer. "I understand better now, and I want to try to do something positive with my anger." Clarissa smiled confidently. "So let's begin this journey together. Justice is not just in the laws we enforce, but in how we listen and act for those who suffer." This moment marked a turning point for Malik and Clarissa. What had begun as an explosive confrontation became a fragile but promising alliance, built on mutual understanding and a desire to transform pain into real justice. A few weeks after their meeting, Malik Johnson began turning his anger into action. Inspired by Judge Clarissa Bennett's words, he became involved in community activities and justice reform initiatives in his city. He knew his voice could carry beyond the courtroom, and he wanted to use it to help those who, like his brother Jamal, had been victims of injustice. Clarissa, meanwhile, had created a mentoring program for troubled youth, offering them a space to understand justice, learn their rights, and express their frustrations constructively. She saw in Malik a living example of how anger could become a positive force. One afternoon, Malik and Clarissa met to discuss progress and future initiatives. Malik spoke passionately about the workshops he had organized in his neighborhood, about the young people who were beginning to understand the importance of justice and dialogue. "It's amazing how receptive they are," he said, his eyes shining. "They need someone to listen to them, to understand their pain. Just like you listened to me." Clarissa nodded, moved by his sincerity. "You see, Malik, justice is not just in the laws we enforce, but in how we listen to and guide those who are lost or hurting. You have transformed your anger into something powerful. Malik smiled, feeling that his efforts were meaningful. He had learned that shouting in a courtroom might attract attention, but that working with determination, with listening and commitment, could truly change lives. The young man thought about his brother Jamal, about all the injustices he had suffered, and felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew that nothing would bring Jamal back, but he could honor his memory by helping others, by ensuring that their voices were heard and respected. For Clarissa, seeing Malik evolve in this way was confirmation that justice could be humane, understanding, and transformative. She had always believed that listening and empathy were powerful weapons in her role, but she had never imagined that the initial confrontation would become the catalyst for such profound change. This chapter in their story wasn't just a lesson for Malik, it was a lesson for the entire community. Justice wasn't a cold, distant concept, it lived in actions, in listening, and in the ability to transform pain and anger into constructive force. Thus, Malik's anger had found a new purpose, and Judge Bennett had found an unexpected ally in the quest for a more humane and equitable justice system. Their collaboration was only just beginning, but it already promised to change lives. The following months were marked by profound change. Malik Johnson, once an angry and desperate young man, had become a respected leader in his community. His initiatives for social justice and justice reform were gaining visibility and impact. Every workshop, every meeting with troubled youth, every civic action strengthened his determination to transform anger into hope. Judge Clarissa Bennett, for her part, was seeing her efforts to make justice more humane bear fruit. Her mentoring program had expanded, and collaborations with local organizations had helped build bridges between young people and the justice system. She continued to oversee her cases with rigor, but with increased sensitivity to the personal stories behind each case. One day, Malik and Clarissa found themselves in the courtroom, but this time in a completely different atmosphere. Their faces no longer reflected the tension of a confrontation, but mutual trust and respect. "Look what we have accomplished," Malik said, smiling. "I never imagined that my anger could lead to something so positive." Clarissa nodded. "You found the strength to turn your pain into action. And you showed the entire community that justice can be understood and experienced as something living, not just as cold rules." Malik felt a deep sense of gratitude. He still remembered the day he'd shouted in the courtroom, accusing the judge of being a murderer. That moment of confrontation, so intense and overwhelming, had been the starting point of a path he'd never dared to imagine. "Thank you for listening to me that day," he murmurs. "If you hadn't let me speak, I don't know where I would be now." Clarissa smiled, touched by the young man's sincerity. Sometimes, justice isn't just about the law. It starts with listening, understanding, and the will to change things. You understand that, Malik. And thanks to you, so do others. In the following weeks, the city of New Haven began to recognize the impact of their collaboration. Inspiring stories circulated, showing how a cry of anger could transform into a positive movement. Malik became a symbol of hope for young people, and Clarissa an example of a judge capable of humanity and compassion. Their paths, once opposed in a courtroom, now converged toward a common goal: to make justice vibrant, accessible, and truly human. And as the sun set over the city, Malik and Clarissa knew this was only the beginning of lasting change, change born of confrontation, but cemented by understanding and reconciliation.